to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'll tell you about two very important subjects. One, the protected passed pawn, and another, the wrong corner bishop. Well, let's start. First of all, what is a protected passed pawn? As you can see in this case, the pawn on f5 we would consider a protected passed pawn because it is protected indeed by another pawn. And it's a passed pawn because there is no enemy pawn in the same file in front of it, or there is no pawn that can stop its way all the way to promotion. Obviously, for the time being, the black king is stopping it from promoting, but nevertheless, this in itself is a major advantage for white. And the reason for that is that while the white king can freely go to the queen side attacking black's pawn, black cannot do the same because anytime the king would try to go behind that white pawn on f5, that pawn would just run away and very quickly become unstoppable, become a queen. If in this position black just keeps waiting, giving up on his own pawn, then there is no much doubt that white will easily win this game by bringing the king back to help his pawns and then advance the pawn, and either the pawn will promote very quickly or the white king will come to f5 and then to g5, capturing a second pawn, and again white would reach an easy win. So this was a very basic and visual example of what is a protected passed pawn and how dangerous it is. Let's look at another example from a rook endgame. Again, in this position, white has a protected passed pawn. Again, there is no black pawn on the e file, neither on f7 that could hold that pawn up. If black would have a pawn on f7, on the square that's highlighted now with green, then the pawn on e5 would not be considered a protected passed pawn because it would be protected but not a passed pawn. So it's important that it's both, that it's a passed pawn and at the same time there is another pawn of the same color protecting it. It's important to understand its importance because that's how you can make a right or wrong decision when it comes to, for example, exchanging pieces. So here there is a question: would rook to c6 offering the exchange of rooks good for black or not? Well, if the white rook would move away, then certainly it wouldn't be a bad move for black. But anytime you're offering to trade rooks and transpose to only king and pawn endgame, you have to be extremely careful because the kings as well as the pawns are very limited in their movements. Pretty much each one of them can only move to one square ahead, unlike all the other pieces like queens and rooks and bishops and knights that are long-range pieces that can go jump around in many squares. Both the pawns and kings are very limited to only advancing one square, while the pawn only ahead, the king in any direction. Nevertheless, they are very slow pieces. So pawn endgames are very predictable for that reason. In this case, this rook move, this offer to exchange rooks, would be a very bad choice for black. because after the exchange of rooks, just like in the previous position, while the white king is free to run after black's passed pawn on h5, the black king is not free to run after white's weak pawns, because then the e-pawn would be just running away with nobody to stop it. Also, if after rook c6 and the exchange of rooks, king f3, the black king is trying to come to protect the h5 pawn, it will arrive too late, as the white king gets to g5 first. And now let's talk about the protected passed pawn in the middle game. First, I would like to share with you one of my own games that I played some years ago in Spain. In this position, my opponent just moved his queen to d4, attacking my knight on b4. He was hoping that I will need to waste time on a purely defensive move, protecting my knight or moving it away, and also defending against the attack on my other knight by the black rook. Fortunately, I found a very nice intermediate move. An intermediate move is when I don't react to the direct threat, but create a counter threat in the meantime, before reacting to the attack. I played a6. Now if the black queen captures the knight, then I'll capture the pawn, creating a fork on both black rooks. Therefore, my opponent did not capture that knight. And also you may wonder what was my plan if my opponent captures my other knight. Then I wanted to capture the pawn on b7, attacking the rook in the corner, and after the rook moves to b8, to play knight c6, attacking the black queen and rook at the same time, and when bishop captures knight, then capturing back with my d-pawn. It's not hard to see how dangerous disconnected, far advanced passed pawns are on c6 and b7. My opponent did not capture either knight in the game, but instead captured my pawn on a6. Now, if I would recapture, let's say with my pawn, then already, of course, I would lose my knight. So I certainly didn't want that to happen. And before I even played a6, I naturally planned something different and better. And namely, it's to move my knight to c6. Now this move not only directly attacks the queen, but also creates a second threat to make a fork with knight e7 check. Therefore, if black wants to avoid material loss, he better captures my knight, which he did. And now I recaptured with the b-pawn, creating a protected passed pawn. As you can see, I have temporarily sacrificed the pawn on the a file. At the moment, my opponent moved his knight to c7, on one hand to protect that pawn, his extra pawn on a6, and at the same time to blockade my protected passed pawn, make sure it does not advance anytime soon. Nevertheless, the protected passed pawn usually is a long-term advantage, and I certainly had no worries about the fact that I'm a pawn down. And let's see, what did I do now? I moved my rook up to a4, attacking the queen. for the time being to clear the a1 corner square for my queen. And when my opponent moved the queen back to b6, I played queen a1. This move not only puts a second pressure on the a6 pawn, but perhaps more importantly, opens the first rank for my rook to move to b1. As you can see, the black queen is in a very sensitive position, easily can be trapped if it's not careful between the rook coming to b1 and my bishop coming to e3. Black has to be really careful, making sure he doesn't lose his queen. And that explains my opponent's next move, which was moving the knight to e8 and clearing some retreat squares for the queen. Of course, the drawback of this was that I could freely capture the pawn on a6, which I did. And here, my opponent retreated with the queen to d8, and while I certainly could capture the pawn on a7, I was in no rush and brought my other rook to the open file to b1, trying to penetrate to the 7th rank to b7. My opponent played f5, looking for some counterplay, and now I captured the pawn on a7. The rest of the game was not very difficult, but it didn't last very long, so I'll just show you the remaining moves of the actual game. Queen b7, knight c7, and pinning the knight with bishop b6. My opponent protected his knight, and knight b5 using the pin. And after rook b8, I had a nice move. I didn't need to settle for a draw by moving the queen to a7 and then being exposed to the black rook constantly attacking my queen. But I was ready to give up on my queen and capture the knight. Of course, in the meantime, attacking the black queen as well. And after knight takes e7, I was ready to give up on my queen again. And here my opponent resigned because he saw that after rook takes queen, the pawn would be unstoppable, as after queen b8, the knight is ready to chase the queen out and then promote the pawn. After my own game, I'd like to share with you a rather famous game that former world champion Alexander Alekhine played against Edward Lasker. In this position, black has a very powerful bishop on d4. That bishop pretty much paralyzes white's position at the time being because it closes down the only open file in the position, and also it creates a pin on the f2 pawn. The reason why that is important in this case is because the bishop on g5 is in major trouble. You can see that black is ready to play h6, attacking the bishop, and when that bishop retreats to h4, then follow up with g5 and trap the bishop. The only way white could potentially save his bishop if he can move his f pawn. But in the meantime, the f2 pawn cannot move because it is pinned. Therefore, white had no other choice but to capture the bishop. That, on the other hand, allows black to get a protected passed pawn, just like in my game. This gives black a major advantage. One of the great things about protected passed pawns is that it usually largely restricts the opponent's mobility also. Naturally, having a protected passed pawn is a long-term advantage as well, because in most endgames it gives a major advantage. So as we said, if white wants to save his bishop on g5, he better plays f3 now, so the bishop will be able to retreat to f2 or e1 if it's being attacked. Now black, slowly but surely, improved the position of his pieces and developed an attack. Let's see how Alekhine did it. Queen f7, and white played bishop to d3. Now queen h5 is not a good idea because it would allow a fork of the white bishop moving to e7. So black played h6, bishop h4, and simply developed his bishop, completed development by attacking now the pawn on c4. Now white had to defend the pawn, and black was ready for an attack. This is somewhat unusual that when you castle on the king's side, on the same side as your opponent, that you would start an attack with your pawns in front of your king. However, as you can see in this particular example, the position is rather closed. There are no open files or diagonals. And that is why black can make an exception from the rule in this case. Bishop retreated and queen g7, an important move to prevent white from advancing his e-pawn to open the light square diagonal for the bishop. White played g4, trying to prevent black doing the same. And now the knight definitely needs to go to e5, a beautiful square for the knight, from where it cannot be chased out, and it's in a great blockading position. And now black needs to look for ways to open the position, and here it comes. Now if white would capture this pawn, which is a temporary pawn sacrifice, black would respond by playing queen h6 and then regaining that pawn on h5. White continued by protecting the pawn with h3. Black traded and occupied quickly the only open file, the h file. Now the rook is ready to come in to attack either on h2 or h3. There's not much white can do about it. In the meantime, white stops the rook coming into the second rank, but it can still come in to the third rank, putting pressure on the f3 pawn. And after white protected that pawn, as typical, the strategical advantage with a little combination transforms to material advantage. And here it comes. Knight captures pawn on f3, and white's position is falling apart because whether white now captures the knight or not, black on the following moves will capture the pawn on g4 and reach a winning material advantage. A very nice game by the former world champion. And now let's switch to the next theme of the lesson, and that is the wrong corner bishop. Let me show you what I mean. Here is this famous example when one side is up an extra bishop and a rook pawn, that is a pawn on the rook's file, on the A or H files, and yet cannot win. Remember this. This is a very important theme. I have saved numerous games thanks to this theoretical drawn endgame. The point here is that as long as the white king reaches that corner square or anywhere near it, it cannot be chased out from one of those 4 squares right around the corner, because the black bishop is of the opposite color of the corner of the promotion square of black's pawn. This position is a draw. White would simply play king b2, and it doesn't matter that black brings the king to help and then advances the pawn. All black would achieve is a stalemate, not a checkmate. The pawn can advance all it wants, but cannot get further than the second rank without, of course, white capturing it if it promotes. And here, for example, king b3 would result a draw, a stalemate. If we go back to the starting position and we would switch this bishop to any dark square, for example e5 or g3 or b6 or anywhere, black would win easily in the same endgame because the white king could be chased out of the corner. Let's see another example. When black has 5 pawns in addition to the bishop. Yet, if it's white to move, the endgame is still a draw, because the white king would march into the corner and none of those additional 4 black pawns can help black to win the game. Of course, remember that if in this position, if it would be black's turn, then black could prevent white from getting into the corner by moving the bishop to f5, controlling the b1 square, and then the white king would need to go the other way to the d file, and the a pawn would just simply promote. So in this position, it's quite important whose turn it is. Let's see the next position, where black has 2 pawns, not just the pawn on the h file, but white has a bishop too. So in these type of positions, it's important to understand that the only task that white has in order to save the game is to get rid of black's knight pawn, that is, black's pawn on the g file. Whether we get to capture that pawn or force that pawn to the same file where the other pawn is, that is to the h file, we would accomplish our goal and save the game. And there is a very beautiful move to accomplish that right away. And it's important to do it right away. I'll explain you why. After bishop h6, the bishop now pins the pawn on g7. When it's pinned, it cannot advance. It can either capture the bishop, in which case white accomplished the goal, or black can try to move out of the pin, in which case white would simply capture the pawn and again achieve the theoretical drawn position where all white needs to do is move back and forth between these 2 squares, or if needed, of course, the other 2 are good enough to walk around. If in the starting position white would be careless and make this move, for example, then already the black king would move out to f7, and after the same attempt of bishop h6, black would have the opportunity to move the pawn to a light square with winning position. And finally, let's see the jewel of the week. Here it comes. In this very interesting endgame, white seems to be in major trouble. To start with, black is a knight ahead and a pawn. The white rook is under attack. True, white has a pawn that's ready to promote, but if we promote the pawn to a queen, black is ready immediately to give a check with a knight, a discovered check, and on the following move, capture our queen. So it's not so simple what to do. Try to figure out the solution. You'll be really pleased when you find it. And here's the answer. The pawn should under-promote to a knight, with a check at the same time protecting the rook on e7. King has no choice but moving to d5. So now white is ready to give perpetual checks, right? Moving the knight back and forth. Very true, but white can do better than that. Can you figure out what's the winning sequence? Yes, it's moving rather the rook to d7, giving a third check. And now checkmate in 2, with an amazing sacrifice right in the middle of the board, forcing black to capture the rook, and then checkmate right in the middle of the board. I hope you enjoyed this beautiful endgame and of course the rest of the lesson. Hope to have you back next week and have a good week.